IB Bio, Plant Biology Part 7, Reproduction B, will focus on distinguishing the following events: pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal. The essential idea is reproduction in flowering plants is influenced by the biotic and abiotic environment. Here is the outline of all the available movies for plant biology for HL students only. Use this outline to find the movie you need for review. This movie is focused here. Plants on Earth today include the mosses, the bryophytes, the ferns, the phyllocynophytes, the coniferophytes, the cone-bearing trees, and the angiospermophytes, the flowering plants. This movie will have its focus with the angiospermophytes, looking specifically at pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal. Remember, among the 4 plant phyla seen here, only coniferophytes and angiospermophytes have seeds to disperse. Plants are composed of roots, stems, leaves, and flowers. Flowers are the reproductive organs of a plant. Meiosis occurs in the flower to produce both the male and female gamete. In this photo, we see flowers and fruits. The fruit develops from the flower following fertilization. The seeds are found within the fruit. Let's look at the life cycle of a plant, and this image is central to the entire story being told in this movie, with its focus on pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal. And I'll start with the flower. Meiosis to produce female gametes occurs in the ovary. Meiosis for the female gamete occurs specifically within the ovule that is within the ovary. Meiosis to produce male gametes occurs in the anther. The male gamete is enclosed within a structure known as pollen. Pollen from one plant reaches the flower of another plant in a process known as pollination. This is gamete transfer. Once the pollen has landed on the stigma, the sperm will move through a pollen tube to fertilize the egg within the ovule. Fertilization is the union of sperm and egg to produce the diploid zygote. Now, the embryo is enclosed within the seed. The fleshy part of the fruit develops around the seed to facilitate dispersal of the seed away from the mother plant. And then, under the right conditions, the seed germinates and grows into an adult plant, a reproductively mature plant that can flower. In this diagram of a flower, meiosis occurs in the anther to produce male gametes, and the sperm is enclosed within a pollen grain, which is transferred to a different plant in a process known as pollination. Pollen arrives at the stigma of a different plant. The pollen arrives due to animals, wind, or water. This is gamete transfer, known as pollination. Now, the petals of a flower serve to attract animal pollinators. As a result of a plant's immobility, mechanisms to move the sperm are important to reproductive success. The sperm reach the egg through a pollen tube that develops along the style of the female part of the plant, and fertilization occurs within the ovule. Fertilization is the union of sperm and egg to produce the diploid zygote. Here's a chance to review flower structures by name, and you need to be able to state a function for each structure as well. Petal and sepal aside, I've color-coded the male and female parts of the flower. Can you identify which is which? The filament of the stamen and the style of the pistil serve to elevate the anther and the stigma respectively, so that contact can be made with animal pollinators. Arriving pollinators serve to transfer the gamete held within the pollen that is produced by nearby plants. When pollen from one plant lands on the stigma of another plant, this is known as pollination. Here is a chance to review the male and female parts of a flower. Where does meiosis occur in the male structure? Where does meiosis occur in the female structure? Where are the pollen formed? Where does the pollen land when pollinators transfer the male gamete? Where does fertilization occur? Where does the sperm make its union with the egg? What structure will become the seed following fertilization? What structure becomes the fruit to facilitate seed dispersal? Here is the singular IB syllabus statement that drives this movie. Explain the reproductive success in plants involving pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal. Pollen is a multicellular structure that has the male gamete within it. Plants are immobile, requiring a mechanism to move the pollen for sexual reproduction to maintain genetic diversity within the species. Insects, birds, some mammals, wind, and water serve to move pollen from one plant to the stigma of another plant in a process known as pollination. If a cross-section of an anther were taken, we could see chambers within the anther, within which there are thousands and thousands of pollen grains. Numerous pollen grains ensures cross-pollination among individuals of the same species. Cross-pollination ensures genetic diversity within the population. Here is a micrograph of an anther cross-section. Pollen grains are held within these chambers. Here is an image of pollen from various species. Each species has uniquely structured pollen. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther of one plant to the stigma of a second individual of the same species, and the sperm cell lies within the multicellular pollen grain. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther of one plant to the stigma of another. Pollination is accomplished by insects, birds, mammals, wind, and water. For animal pollinators, they are rewarded for their efforts with nectar or some edible pollen. Pollination is the transfer of pollen from the anther of one plant to the stigma of a second individual of the same species. Pollination is accomplished by animals, insects, birds, mammals, or other transfer mechanisms such as wind or water. And once the pollen has arrived on the stigma, a pollen tube grows down through the style, providing the sperm access to the egg within the ovule, where fertilization will occur. Here is an insect serving as a pollinator, carrying pollen from one plant to another amidst its body hairs. Here is a bird serving as a pollinator. Here are photographs of small mammals serving as pollinators. Animal pollinators are rewarded for their efforts with food, nectar, or edible pollen. So that brings us to important IB syllabus statements. Explain the mutualistic plant-pollinator relationship. State that most flowering plants use mutualistic relationships with pollinators in sexual reproduction. And I'm going to ask you to define mutualism. Mutualism is a symbiosis that is beneficial to both organisms involved. Pollen is transferred among individuals of the same species. Pollen and nectar provide food for the pollinator. Insects use UV wavelengths for vision, and flowers have adapted to draw pollinators toward the center of the flower, increasing the chance that there will be contact with the anther and stigma. Flowers are adapted in many ways to accommodate the pollinator for the purposes of moving pollen to achieve the genetic variation that comes with sexual reproduction. Most flowering plants use mutualistic relationships with pollinators in sexual reproduction. Here is pollen being blown by wind from male cones of a coniferophyte. Plants that do not have showy flowers are often wind pollinated. While coniferophytes do not have flowers, they do have pollen. Remember that coniferophytes produce seeds. For aquatic plants, water also serves to distribute pollen. Once the pollen has landed on the stigma in a process known as pollination, a nucleus within the pollen grain grows a pollen tube down through the style, and the sperm cells follow. The pollen tube reaches the ovary and then the ovule, providing the sperm access to the egg. Within the ovule, there are numerous haploid cells, but there is only one haploid egg cell. The sperm cell fertilizes the egg in a process known as fertilization. Fertilization results in a diploid zygote that develops into an embryo that can be found within the seed. Here is a formal definition of fertilization, a process in sexual reproduction that involves the union of male and female gametes, each with a single set of chromosomes, to produce a diploid zygote. In case you're interested in the details about pollen, the pollen grain is composed of more than one cell, within which are haploid nuclei. There is a tube nucleus that builds the pollen tube, and there are two sperm nuclei derived by mitosis from the generative nucleus. The sperm nuclei follow the tube nucleus down the pollen tube toward the ovule. Here is a photograph of pollen grains stuck to the stigma of a flower. Here is a micrograph of pollen grains, some of which have a pollen tube growing from them. Here is a micrograph of a cross-section of a stigma, and you can see pollen grains here and pollen tubes growing down into the style here and here. The pollen tube grows down through the style to reach the ovule. The sperm cell fertilizes the egg cell housed within the ovule. Once fertilization occurs, the ovule develops into a seed within which there is a diploid embryo. The ovary wall becomes the fleshy part of the fruit. You can see in this diagram how the sperm nucleus will reach the egg. Upon fertilization, an embryo will develop. Also, within the ovule, there are two haploid nuclei called polar nuclei. The polar nuclei will be fertilized by the second sperm nucleus to form the nutritious tissue called endosperm. It is the endosperm that humans enjoy when they eat seeds. So in essence, fertilization in plants is really a double fertilization. Once the pollen tube penetrates the ovule, two sperm nuclei are released. One fertilizes the egg and one fertilizes the polar nuclei to form the triploid endosperm. The endosperm is the source of nutrition for a germinating seed before photosynthesis begins. So, fertilization is a process in sexual reproduction that involves the union of male and female gametes, each with a single set of chromosomes, to produce a diploid zygote. But once fertilization has occurred, the seed must be dispersed away from the mother plant. This is called seed dispersal. And seed dispersal is the movement or transport of seeds, diploid structures, away from the parent plant. Seeds are dispersed by water, wind, or animals. Hopefully you recognize these images as seed dispersal, mechanisms to move or transport seeds away from the parent plant. Seeds are dispersed by water, wind, or mammals, or birds. Hopefully you recognize these images as seed dispersal, mechanisms to move or transport seeds away from the parent plant. Seeds are dispersed by water, wind, or mammals, or birds. Hopefully you recognize these images as seed dispersal, mechanisms to move or transport seeds away from the parent plant. In these photos, we have 4 animals dispersing seeds. The seeds within the burr that sticks to the fur of a mammal or a bird, the seeds within the poop of bears or monkeys. In this photo, we see fruit, fleshy and sweet, to attract an animal that will disperse the seeds within the fruit. This is a mutualistic relationship between animal and plant. The plant achieves seed dispersal, while the animal receives some food. By the way, the fleshy, sweet portion of the fruit develops from the ovary wall of the original flower. The fruit attracts an animal that takes in the nutrition with the fruit attracts an animal that takes in the nutrition within the fruit, but unwittingly moves the seed to a location away from the mother plant. This is so that the young plant is not in direct competition with its larger mother plant. Now, the relationship between the animal that moves the seed and the plant is a mutualistic relationship. The plant achieves seed dispersal while the animal receives food. In this diagram, we have an apple fruit, and the fleshy, sweet portion of the fruit attracts animals that will transport the seeds away from the mother plant. This ensures that the young plant growing from the seed will not compete with the larger mother plant for resources. Here are images of cherry and raspberry fruits. And here is a cucumber, also a fruit with seeds within. Here is a citrus fruit. This is the IB syllabus statement that I have followed throughout this movie. Explain the reproductive success in plants involving pollination, fertilization, and seed dispersal. Can you explain reproductive success on the basis of these three processes? I'll let you study this slide on your own. At the very least, take the time to gain control of these three definitions. You should be able to describe each process with examples. Can you explain the mutualistic plant-pollinator relationship? Most flowering plants use mutualistic relationships with pollinators in sexual reproduction, and mutualism is a symbiosis that is beneficial to both organisms involved. And that brings us to the end of IB Bio Plant Biology Part 7, Reproduction B. Reproduction C, the last movie in the plant biology series, is a very short movie that will look more closely at seeds. Seeds are composed of an embryo and nutritious endosperm surrounded by a resistant seed coat. Seeds germinate and then develop into a new adult plant.